In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises, Inc. and IT&E.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to In Full Zoom. I'm Nestor Licanto. I'd like to welcome our special guests for this week's, and they're going to talk about an exhibit called Remember Saigon from Vietnam to Guam. And I'm joined by Dr. Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi and Dr. Yến Lê Espiritu, mom and daughter. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Good morning.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right, I'll just throw out the question, and whoever wants to answer can respond. Tell us, first of all, about this exhibit. What is it all about?
Yeah, so Remembering Saigon from Vietnam to Guam, an exhibit that we have put together at Tumon Sands Plaza, open to the public. We invite everyone to come by. But this exhibit really looks at the connections and intimate relations between Guam and Vietnam, both during the Vietnam War, as well as during Operation New Life. So as a lot of folks know, Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam played key roles during the Vietnam War, as well as our Chamorro community. We have a lot of Vietnam War veterans who served during the Vietnam War, and we really want to highlight their stories, as well as some artifacts in the exhibit. And then, of course, after the Vietnam War ended, Governor Ricky Bordallo, invited and said yes to Operation New Life, which was when over 112,000 Vietnamese refugees were processed in Guam. They were at Andersen Air Force Base and Tin City, as well as Arodi Point. We had Tent City, but I'm sure a lot of folks remember as well at Camp Asin and Asin Beach. There were a lot of refugee tents there as well. And so we really wanted to highlight Guam's role in this humanitarian refugee resettlement, the stories of Vietnamese refugees who passed through Guam and their memories in the exhibit. So we have videos, we have audio, we have photographs from that era, as well as more contemporary as well. So we really encourage folks to check it out.
Yeah, I remember personally as a young teenager going to that Asin. Tell us about your life stories. Tell us about your background, Dr. Espiritu.
Yes, first of all, I want to really just commend Evyn on this wonderful exhibit that she has helped to create, and we really invite everyone to come to partake. I'm Yến Lê Espiritu, so I'm a professor of ethnic studies at UC San Diego, and I also do research on the migration of Vietnamese refugees through Guam and then eventually to other parts of the country. Of the U.S. But I'm here, I think, to also share that I was one of the refugees who came through Guam in 1975, and we left Vietnam. I can't remember the exact day. I was only 12 years old at the time, but we left in the very final days, so 1 or 2 days prior to April 30th, the actual fall of Saigon. And I think I remember that because it wasn't until we got to Guam that the Vietnamese people learned about the fall of Saigon. And I still remember the shock that people felt. And because I think when people left, it was like this panic moment, and people left because everyone seemed to be leaving. And it's like, we didn't want to, to stay if something bad were to happen. But I don't think anyone really believed that it was for good. And I don't think people really believed that Saigon was going to fall. And so the fall of Saigon for us happened here on the island. We heard it on the radio, and I just remember the shocked silence that people felt. And I think that was when it really sank in that we weren't gonna go back. And I think I still remember that, even though I was very young. I don't think I really knew what was happening, but I remember the intensity of the feeling of that moment. And yeah, so we stayed here for us maybe 10 days or 2 weeks, and then we went to California.
Yeah. What do you remember about Camp Asin back then as a 12-year-old?
I don't remember much. I remember because I think we were among the first people to get here, so it wasn't ready per se. So we came here, and I think we stayed in a big stadium of some sort, and so people were still getting the place ready. But I remember standing in long lines to get what I thought was really bad food because it was American food and it was very foreign. Lots and lots of people around, as I say, people were very confused. I remember more that kind of feelings of being disoriented, not know what we were doing here, how long we were staying. I remember having to experience public shower for the first time. So that was, just also very, disorienting and unpleasant. I just remember a lot of people hustling around. I guess they were military people hustling around getting things ready. So everything was just, very chaotic.
Dr. Evyn, of course, you weren't born back then, but how has this exhibit helped you kind of retrace your parents' roots?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, I first started learning about my grandmother's story actually when I was an undergrad in college. So I was actually a history major and was really interested in learning more about the history of the Vietnam War and learning more about the history of Vietnamese refugees who left and where they ended up around the world, including in California. And part of this was inspired by my personal history. So I just started, interviewing my grandmother. I made a brief film about her and her story. We went back to Vietnam together and interviewed her relatives, which is a very special moment. And I think that really opened the door for a longer kind of lifelong research interest in the stories of Vietnamese refugees. So I recently wrote a book on Operation New Life. And then I think I wanted as well to partner with Guam Philharmonic to bring this story to Guam's public as well with this public history exhibit. So, I think that my mom and grandmother inspire a lot of what I do. And I just really want as well for Guam's role in this important history to be remembered as well.
In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises Inc. and IT&E. In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises Inc. and IT&E.
Yeah, how would you describe Guam's role to Guamanians and Chamorros who weren't alive back then?
Yeah. I mean, Guam, I'll talk a little bit and then I'm sure my mom can chime in as well. But Guam was the first major US processing center for Vietnamese refugees. So from April to November 1975, as we mentioned, over 112,000 Vietnamese refugees were here. Even on one boat, you would have almost 13,000 people come on a single day in May. So it was a huge influx in people. Of course, the US military was coordinating a lot of this, but you also had local people, Chamorros volunteering for the Red Cross. They volunteered to help pass out food and clothing. The Red Cross was connecting a lot of people, a lot of families who were trying to find their loved ones, whether or not they would get out. And then we also had, a lot of people who were sponsoring Vietnamese refugees who actually wanted to stay here in Guam. So Monsignor David I. Kitagua, which I know a lot of folks know, unfortunately, he recently passed away, but he was the main one who was sponsoring Vietnamese refugees who wanted to stay here, cooperate with the fishing industry and contribute as well. But we also had, the Baza family was adopting and sponsoring a lot of folks as well. So I think that, very much the Vietnamese refugee community has been integrated here in the community in Guam.
Yeah, Dr. Yan?
I think if you have Filipino folks in the audience, I think it's important to also realize that initially the US had intended for the Vietnamese refugees to be resettled in the Philippines because it's much closer, one of the Air Force bases. However, because the Philippines is its own independent country, it did not have to say yes to the US. And so my trek from Vietnam to Guam, we stopped in the Philippines for just to refuel because by that time the US, the Philippine government, Marcos, had decided that they didn't want to resettle refugees. So it was that decision that eventually led us to Guam because the governor here agreed for a number of reasons to, to accept the refugees. And I think it's important for me to, to thank the Chamorro people who own this land for their hospitality, intended or otherwise, because if you can just imagine, I mean, the island is small, and we just had like this wave of so many people, over 100,000 people eventually to come to this island. And it must have been very disruptive, and it took away a lot of the resources for the local people, including things such as, school buses. School buses weren't transporting students during the time because they were transporting refugees, and the impact on the environment, on the water availability, on all of those things. So even though I was only here for a short time, I think that the hospitality of the Chamorro people was so instrumental for our ability to either stay here or continue on.
Yeah, absolutely. The people of Guam are very, very accommodating people. What are some of the stories that your parents told you about their experience, leaving Vietnam and resettling, like in your case in California?
It would be you.
Yeah, Dr. Yen.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I was experiencing it. So we left with my mom. So yes, and from here we went to California. And if you know California, just again, initial memories, we drove from, I think, Northern California to Southern California. And then I just remember the Freeway 10, like this is a very long road because we kept going. But I think I would just speak for myself. Being 12 years old at the time, I had to eventually go to school. And I remember, so we came to California around May. So it was, I didn't have to go to school. So I had the whole summer, but I didn't speak any English at the time. And so for me, like the most consuming thing in my mind was I had to go to school. I had to interact with, American people whom I imagined to be all white, but of course that wasn't the case. And I didn't speak any English. And I remember thinking, if I just stayed in this apartment forever, it would be fine. Everything would be fine. I would have to meet no one. And of course that didn't happen because eventually I did leave and learn English. But I think that was really scary to, to go to, I think, junior high. It's scary to be in junior high or middle school in the US in any case. But, to come in at that age where everyone was trying to be who they are and try, to discover and be and become whoever the adolescent years. So I think not just for myself, but for refugees who were young and who had to immediately interact with the American system in a way that their parents might not have to, and have to learn English quickly and have to interface. Like school is where Vietnamese refugee interface first, right, with American society. So that was, very unsettling and scary. And I remember that people would say, oh, you must be so nice, because I would smile all the time because I didn't know what they were saying. So I'm just thinking, if I would smile, I'm just hoping that what they were saying was nice. But I'm, not like I'm naturally nice or anything, but it's like a refugee adaptation.
Dr. Evyn, talk to us a little bit more about your book and in your interviews about the assimilation process from Vietnam to the United States, and all that story.
Yeah, for sure. So the book is called Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine. So one of the main case studies that I look at is Vietnamese refugees in Guam, as well as people who passed through Guam and resettled in the continental United States. So I was really interested in thinking about, for Vietnamese Americans who decided to stay here in Guam, what is their kind of role in the larger Guam community, the larger Chamorro community, To what degree are they participating in some of these conversations that are happening around island, around decolonization? But also, why did they decide to stay in Guam when so many people decided to actually move on to the continental United States, such as my family? And I think that they found a lot of cultural similarities as well with Guam's larger community, but in particular the Chamorro community. There's a long kind of shared history of colonization and militarization. So Vietnam was colonized by France for a long time. Of course, we know Spanish influence is very strong here in Guam. But also, I think that both cultures were very family oriented. That was something that came up in a lot of the interviews. People really appreciated the weather here on Guam. It's very similar to the humidity and the heat in Vietnam. And Guam, of course, is also very close to Vietnam, just geographically. And of course, that's one of the reasons that Operation New Life was one of the key processing centers for Vietnam after the war. Even after the war, that proximity allowed a lot of the people who live here to be just much more closer to their family members back in Vietnam than California, right? It takes many, many hours to fly from California back to Vietnam, whereas the trip is much easier for folks and communities who are still living here. So that, I think is part of one of the reasons that they chose Guam as a home.
In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises Inc. and IT&E. In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises Inc. and IT&E.
Can you tell us a story of, give us an example of one family and their story?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about the Baza family. So their story is actually a little interesting because it frames both the Vietnam War as well as Operation New Life. So Raymond T. Baza is a Chamorro Vietnam War veteran. He served in the U.S. Army psychological operations in the early 1970s. And he actually ended up meeting his, who would become his wife, Lee T. Baza, when she was a nurse. So she was a nurse serving in the South Vietnamese military. She joined the military initially to actually find her parents who were killed by the Viet Cong. And so they actually met when Raymond was injured. Lee tended to him. And they eventually, had to separate, but then found each other again in Saigon and decided to get married. And so when they got married, Lee came here to Guam. So that was, of course, before Operation New Life happened. But then once Vietnamese refugees started coming here in mass because of the fall of Saigon, that couple was actually very instrumental in helping to organize a lot of the refugee resettlement efforts here. So Raymond was able to tap into his network of other Chamorro Vietnam War veterans who had married Vietnamese refugees or who had Vietnamese American connections. And Lee was very instrumental in translating for all of these people, who are coming in. She's been here for 2 or 3 years, once Operation New Life happened. So she was able to, resettle and assimilate a bit more and then ease the way and just calm, the fears of all of these people who were coming in afterwards.
How many of the Vietnamese refugees stayed on Guam? Do you have a number?
Yeah, so initially it was about 2,000 who decided to stay in Guam and make it their home. Since then, some people have moved off island or gone back to Vietnam and reunited with their families, but initially it was about 2,000. Yeah.
And Dr. Yen, was there any strong urge for you to go back to Vietnam and stay, or would you always wanted to remain in the United States?
Well, you may recall the first 20 years after the end of the Vietnam War, there was a U.S. embargo, which meant that Vietnamese could not return to to Vietnam even for a visit. So that was really, really difficult. And this was, of course, pre-internet time. So any communication with Vietnam was through letters, which could take months, or which you don't know what we received or didn't receive. So even when we were to send very needed money back to Vietnam, it would take a long time because it would have to go to France first, and then from France to Vietnam. So for the first 20 years, it was just not even possible because of the US embargo. And yeah, so I think that people today don't realize how difficult it was to keep in contact with your family. For example, one of my uncle and her granduncle passed during that time, and we didn't know for a long time, until the letter made its way to the US. And so I think it's important to also acknowledge those experiences in the 20 years where Vietnamese people were not allowed to keep in contact with their families. So whether or not we wanted to return, it was beside the point because we were not able to return. So in fact, my mother and I only got our US citizenship once the embargo was over, because only to go back to Vietnam. That was, for us, the US passport meant really returning to Vietnam. For me, when they were little, I have 3 children, Evyn is the oldest. So when they were little, we would go to Vietnam every summer. And we did that for at least over a decade. And so the youngins, the little Evyn and her siblings feel very close to being Vietnam because we spent many happy times with family, cousins, the extended family that many people enjoy. I just didn't get to have that once I came here. So that was a really a big, a huge impact, because I went from a huge extended family, my mother, one of 10 siblings, to just like a very small unit. So when we were able to, the kids would go back to Vietnam, and I think that that's one of the fondest memories, was just being with their cousins, so many of them, for like 3 weeks to a month every summer. So once we were able to, that became our routine. And yeah, I still, if I had an opportunity to travel, when I travel, my first choice is always to go back to Vietnam.
In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises Inc. and IT&E. In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises Inc. and IT&E.
It sounds like you have some kind of bittersweet memories of the evacuation from Vietnam, but also assimilating in the United States. Kind of how you feel?
Oh yeah, no, I would say that that's the case, because even regardless of how quote unquote successful anyone becomes, or what, how successful I have become, it's still not the life that I would have had or could have had. And I think that the sentiment of what could have been is always something that refugees experience. And it has little connection to their lives now. It's just that the life that they didn't get to have. It's always, I wonder what would have been. Like, for example, I would, coming to the US when you are 12 years old means, so for most people at that age, they are discovering who they are, they're discovering dating, or, all of those, fun, kind of innocent things. For me, it was like learning English, figuring out what the US is all about, learning about race, learning about discrimination. So it's just a very different type of adolescence. And I think that's what being a refugee means. It replaces the experiences that you would have had with something completely different, not necessarily worse, just different. And so I always think, what would have life have been like had I stayed in Vietnam for those adolescent years?
Yeah, fascinating. Dr. Evyn, kind of wrap this up for us. I think my light went out, so sorry. Apologize for that. But tell us what people can expect at the exhibit at the Tumon Sands Plaza.
For sure. Well, maybe to answer that question, I can share some of the story of some of the people who actually did go back to Vietnam from Guam. So the repatriation story is also a major story from Operation New Life. So this was a group of about 1,600 Vietnamese refugees who came here to Guam. And instead of resettling here, or instead of like going to California or other places in the continental United States, they actually decided to risk their lives and return to Vietnam. So this was a very risky move. As my mom mentioned, there were not diplomatic relations between the United States and the currently unified, communist government in Vietnam. And so there was a lot of debate about what would happen to these Vietnamese refugees. The US and the UNHCR didn't want to be responsible for them if they were to go back. But they were quite insistent for a number of different reasons. A lot of these people were military people who were on a warship or who were on a plane, South Vietnamese military plane or US military plane. And kind of in the chaos in the last days of war, they got redirected to Guam and they left behind their wives, they left behind their children, their family members, and they really wanted to reunite with those folks. And so they wanted to go back. So this repatriation painting of one of the repatriates is something that's really special in the museum. Something that's also really special is we have actually created a miniature replica of the Vietnam War Memorial here in the exhibit. So there were 77, local soldiers who sacrificed their lives and were either killed in action or missing in action from Guam, as well as the CNMMI. So we wanted to create, an engraving with those to honor those folks, those 77 names. So we encourage folks, if you have a relative, you can actually come and see their name and create an engraving or a rubbing of their name. So we have their photographs as well as this memorial that was specially made for the exhibit. So, I definitely encourage folks to check it out at Tumon Sands Plaza. So we're open Tuesday to Sunday, noon to 6 p.m. And we have a lot of public programming that's also organized and associated with the exhibit. So definitely stay tuned for that.
Absolutely. More than 40 years later, there's still a lot of strong memories about that period. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot of visitors at that exhibit. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi and Dr. Yến Lê Espiritu, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
I'm Nestor Licanto. We'll see you again next week on In Full Zoom.
All right, take care.
In Full Zoom is presented by Calvo Enterprises Inc. and IT&E.